Herman J. Cohen was appointed Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs in May last year. He was born and educated in New York City, having graduated from City College, cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa. He was a political science major there, and following his graduation was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army, where he served for 2 years in West Germany. In 1955, he began his Foreign Service career with the Department of State, where he has remained ever since. He has held 7 assignments abroad in various capacities as political officer, labor attaché, economic officer, and administrative specialist. He has specialized in African affairs with overseas assignments in Uganda, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Zaire, and Senegal. From 1970 to 1974, he served as Director for Central African Affairs in the Department of State, and from 1987 to 1989, he was Senior Director for African Affairs on the National Security Council. He has also been twice assigned to the American Embassy in Paris, as well as holding a number of senior management positions during the course of his career. He is the recipient of many honorary awards and serves on a number of civic boards too. Secretary Cohen's topic tonight is Southern Africa in Transition, the U.S. role. Will you join me in welcoming him to the Baltimore Council, our Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, the Honorable Herman Cohen.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Riggs. A very nice introduction, and I want to apologize to all of you for being late. I could say that the traffic tied me up on the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. That's not the truth. I was tied up with the Foreign Minister of Namibia, who is in the State Department. And if there's anything we know how to do, it's now we can drop names around. My business. I'm very glad that mention was made of Arthur Houghton. In 1955, I was a junior Foreign Service officer, fresh in the service right out of the Army, and I was assigned to the American Embassy in Paris. And not long after I arrived there, they said, well, once every 3 months or so, you have to be the duty officer. What does that mean? Well, it means on the weekend, you sit in the ambassador's office, and you're available to help the ambassador. And I was really scared of that, because I was intimidated by this big embassy. So I went into the ambassador's office on Saturday morning, and I did all the things I was supposed to do, and in walks this gentleman. His name was Houghton. He was the American ambassador to France. And he said, "Good morning, Mr. Cohen." And he started talking to me, and all my fears of being a junior Foreign Service officer evaporated. And he took the time to spend with me, and I know he was very busy. So I want to echo the fact that he is a great man. He was a great man, and I'm now very happy to be working with his son, Amo Houghton, who is a member of the House Committee on Africa. And we spent a lot of time talking, so I'm very close to that family, and I'm very glad that he was connected with this World Affairs Council. We're talking about South Africa this evening, Southern Africa, and it is definitely an area in transition. It's very exciting right now, and we're very much involved in a variety of ways. And I think maybe the best way to talk about it is to begin with December 1988, when there's some very important agreements were signed in New York. This was the agreement to give Namibia independence, and the other agreement was for the Cuban troop withdrawal from Angola. These two agreements were brokered by the United States, by my predecessor, Assistant Secretary Chester Crocker, and it involved Cuba, South Africa, and Angola. These agreements transformed the whole landscape in Southern Africa in a very positive way. How did that happen? First of all, the fact that the Cubans were leaving Angola and agreed to do it, and that the Soviet Union helped the process by encouraging the Cubans to leave, meant that the Cold War in Southern Africa was no longer a factor. There was no longer any element of competition between the Soviet Union and the United States for influence or position in Southern Africa. Secondly, the fact that South Africa was willing to give up Namibia after many, many years of struggle, diplomatic struggle, military struggle, political struggle, meant that a new generation of leaders in South Africa was coming to the fore that was willing to be cooperative and reasonable about the future. Because for generations, people have been saying in South Africa that we can't give up Namibia. It's our cushion against the communist onslaught. We must always keep Namibia. So the fact that they were willing to give it up meant that important changes were about to happen. So as a result of that, you had a number of developments. First of all, the people of South Africa decided that the only way to have a good future for the white community, that is, the white people of South Africa decided, was to bring about the type of political transformation which would bring the black majority community into a state of total equality in political life. Why did they reach that conclusion? Well, they made a very sober analysis of the future. And they saw that the apartheid system in South Africa could not work, was totally unviable, because South Africa, as a modern industrial state, needs constant economic growth in order to maintain the current standard of living of the white community. The only way the economic growth that is required could be achieved was to have full participation by the black majority. The blacks have to be consumers, they have to be producers, they have to have education, they have to be full participants in modern life, or else the standard of living of the white community itself was doomed to decline, and that the grandchildren of the present leadership generation of the white community would really have no future in South Africa. Now, this was not a moral judgment that was being made by the white leadership. It was a very cold economic analysis of South Africa's position. Now, on top of this analysis, you also had very important political developments. Between 1984 and 1988, the black community was really in a state of confrontation. We here in the United States saw this virtually every night on the television, where you saw instability, where you saw white policemen using their clubs and their guns on black demonstrators. Now, this hit home to the United States just as it hit home to countries all over the world. And as a result of that, the international community reacted. We had economic sanctions enacted by the Congress in 1986. Other governments did the same thing. In addition, and probably more powerful than economic sanctions, you had individual business firms around the world, especially the international banking community, deciding that South Africa was no longer a good political risk, and therefore the flow of finance to South Africa to finance expansion of industry, to finance expansion of agriculture, to finance the expansion of employment, dried up. So that between 1984 and 1988, there was a net outflow of money from South Africa of $12 billion, which is a lot for a country of that size. So the facts of the cold economic facts of the future of South Africa, as well as international pressure, caused the leadership of the white community to say, we must totally transform political life in South Africa so that we have total equality among all the communities and that we no longer judge people by their race or ethnic group. Now, this analysis was made under the government of P.W. Botha, the former president of South Africa, but he was totally incapable of starting the process. And it only started with the new generation of leadership coming into power in September of 1989 under the leadership of President F.W. de Klerk, who told us early on that he was determined to bring about the necessary changes to bring about a non-racial democratic society in South Africa. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, on the side of the black political leadership, there was also changes taking place in thinking about the future of South Africa. Between 1980 and 1988, the basic philosophy governing politics in the black community was confront the white government, confront the white power structure, bring that white power structure to its knees so that they will negotiate a transfer of power to the legitimate majority of the people. The idea was, just as in other parts of Africa, you make the country ungovernable by constant confrontation, by strikes, by demonstrations, what have you, constant upheaval, and the white power structure will crumble away. By 1988, it was quite clear that this policy was not working, that the repressive forces of the white government were so great that it was totally impossible to cause the white power structure to disintegrate. So therefore, a new thinking had to take place. And that new thinking was that power must be transferred to the black majority through a new constitution, which can only be brought about through a negotiated, peaceful discussion with the leadership of the white power structure. So these two trends coincided in 1989 with the election of F.W. de Klerk as the new president of South Africa and the release of Nelson Mandela very recently from prison after 27 years of imprisonment. Now, these two gentlemen represent, in our view, the mainstream of thinking in both the communities of South Africa today, which is that there must be a new form of government in South Africa, which must be democratic, it must be non-racial, it must be majority rule. This must come about through negotiation and not through confrontation. And it must include appropriate safeguards for all people, whether they're minority or majority or whatever their ethnic group, in terms of a Bill of Rights, which can be protected by an independent judiciary. This is the mainstream of thinking in South Africa today, both the black community and in the white community. This is a major breakthrough from only 1 year ago, when we saw nothing but confrontation and repression succeeding each other. Okay, so what is the United States' role in all of this? Well, we were part of the international community that exercised its judgment to put pressure on the white community through economic sanctions. American businesses, banks joined us in that by either pulling out of South Africa or stopping financial flows to add to the pressure on that government. So we played a role in bringing about the changed thinking that is now taking place in South Africa. We also were very frank with the black community throughout these years, telling them that we were opposed to violence and that we were opposed to confrontation and that we believe in a negotiated settlement. Now we feel that this objective has been achieved and that negotiations are going to settle the future of South Africa. So what are we concentrating on right now? We're concentrating on support for negotiations. We're telling everyone we believe in the negotiating process, we will support it as much as we can, and we will criticize those who resort to violence and those who refuse to negotiate, whether it comes from the black side of the fence or the white side of the fence. Secretary Baker was in South Africa very recently, and he had a chance to meet the various political leaders, and he went away with the feeling that both F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela are very sincere in this desire to reach a negotiated settlement, and both these gentlemen and their organizations deserve support from the United States government. He also came away from South Africa with the strong understanding that there are elements on both sides that oppose negotiations and do not believe in a democratic society in South Africa. On the side of the white community, 30% of the last vote went to groups, Conservative Party and others, who want to continue the repressive system of apartheid, who want to carve out a separate white state in South Africa. And I've met them. They're running around South Africa with little maps showing what part of South Africa they want to become a lily white state. And these people oppose the negotiating process and will do everything possible to sabotage it. On the side of the black majority, there are people who say negotiations with the government of South Africa are immoral, that the government of South Africa is illegitimate, and that negotiation should not take place, and the confrontational process, the armed struggle, should continue. So we find that the situation in South Africa is quite fragile right now, and that the two mainstreams, moderate negotiating groups of Nelson Mandela and President F.W. de Klerk, deserve our full support. That is why President Bush has invited both of these gentlemen to visit the United States, to show our support for them, and to talk to them about the future of South Africa and to see how we can fit into the process and provide assistance. We are thinking strongly now of providing money to help prepare the black community to assume positions of power in South Africa after the apartheid system is abolished. Why are we thinking that? Well, because so many of the political leaders of South Africa have spent a long time in prison. They've been a long time in exile. All of their structures have been destroyed over the years, and they really need help in getting started again. And we think as we worked for democracy in Nicaragua and as we work for democracy in Poland, we feel that we should be there helping leaders of the black community and their followers to prepare for a new era in South Africa. We have had a budget there of about $32 million a year for the last 4 years in scholarship work and human rights work, helping the victims of apartheid and community organization. And we're thinking very seriously now of extending that with some more funding in order to help prepare blacks for leadership positions in government, in business, and in the various professions. On the white side, we have reached an agreement with the United States Congress that the amount of sanctions that we have applied to South Africa are sufficient for the moment, that we should not go for any more sanctions now that the government is starting a negotiating process, has started to release political prisoners, and has allowed political organizations to work. We have a consensus agreement with Congress that we should not apply any more pressure at the present time. And at such time as the government fulfills all of the requirements of our sanctions legislation, such in terms of lifting the state of emergency and releasing all political prisoners, we will then consult with the Congress again to see if we might want to modify or suspend some of the economic sanctions that were applied in 1986. And no decision has been made on that until we really consult closely with the United States Congress. Now that is the internal situation in South Africa. There's also exciting developments externally. The agreement on having Cuban forces leave Angola has resulted in a momentum developing in that country to settle the civil conflict in Angola between the government and the UNITA guerrillas who have been fighting each other since 1975. The South African forces have left Angola, Cuban forces are virtually out, and we feel now the time has come for Angolans to work together to solve their internal conflict through a negotiated settlement, which would bring all Angolans into a new type of government, which we hope will be based on free democratic elections. The United States has given support to the UNITA guerrillas since 1986 in an effort to prevent them from being crushed by the government, which has had tremendous amounts of Soviet military assistance, in order to provide incentives for a negotiated settlement. We believe negotiations will begin between UNITA and the government in the very, very near future, and we hope that by the end of this year, they should be able to reach an agreement on what we call national reconciliation for Angola. The same thing is happening in Mozambique. By giving independence to Namibia, South Africa signaled that it wanted an entirely new relationship with the countries in the region. And that new relationship meant cooperation, economic exchange, diplomatic exchange, as opposed to confrontation that had been going on for the last 10 years. As a result of this, South African support for Renamo rebels in Mozambique has dried up, and we find that the negotiating situation there is even better than it is in Angola, and we're hoping that negotiations there will begin within days rather than weeks. So we have hopes now for peaceful settlement both inside South Africa and in Angola and Mozambique. And the United States is working actively to bring all the parties together in all three of those countries. The bottom line, we feel, is that Southern Africa is already very wealthy. It is already well developed, has abundant natural resources, has very skilled populations, and we feel that Southern Africa will be the motor of development for virtually all of the rest of Africa. As most of you know, Africa is in deep economic crisis at the present time. They're suffering from debt. They're suffering from lack of economic growth. They're suffering from overabundance of population growth. They're suffering from AIDS in many countries. We believe that the Southern Africa region is where the motor for development will start. And that is why we're so anxious to bring about peace in the various areas. And while we're even now, before peace has been achieved, we're trying to bring about economic cooperation between South Africa and the other countries and among the other countries themselves. We're providing assistance to infrastructure and transportation. We're providing assistance to the development of trade links between the various countries, and we're providing educational and health assistance. So we are looking to Southern Africa as the important area, not only for Southern Africa itself, but for the rest of Africa. And we hope that the peace movement in all of these countries will really take off, and that the United States can contribute to all of them, just as we contributed to the independence of Namibia and the departure of both South African and Cuban forces from Angola. Okay, I would like to stop now and open it up to discussion.
Would the ambassador kindly comment on the role of youth in this process of change, both black and white? And secondly, on whether the government of South Africa really understands what's demanded of it.
On the role of youth, I think that's a very important question. I would say that the changing thinking in the white community, which I described before, really started with the university students, especially the Afrikaner university students, because within the Afrikaner group among the whites, you had the hardest line: we will never give up control of this country. Must always have apartheid and white domination. The first chinks in that armor came from the white university students in places like Stellenbosch, which is really the heartland of Afrikanerdom. This started, I would say, 1984, 1985. The first people to go up to Lusaka in Zambia to visit the ANC. Very courageous move, because every day on South African radio, the African National Congress are terrorists. They're communists. We can't deal with them. It's treason to deal with them. So the first people to break all of this taboos were white students and white Afrikaner students. I think the world owes them a debt of gratitude for starting breaking the ice there. Black youth have also played a major role in the confrontational element, staying away from school, boycotts and what have you. Now, we have always told them that we're opposed to violence, but I must admit that some of the confrontational tactics used by the black youth in the black townships and outside the black townships did play a role in the changing thinking in the white community, bringing home to them the feeling of the great rage that existed within the black townships. Right now, I'm a bit worried about the black youth, because I mentioned before that there are strong elements within the black community that oppose negotiations. They feel that the government is illegitimate and that the black leaders should not negotiate with the government. Well, this has an appeal to the black youth right now, because many of them are unemployed. One of the negative effects of economic sanctions has been the stopping of economic growth, and when there's no economic growth, young people coming on the labor market are unable to find jobs. So you have a growing pool of unemployed youth in their 20s who are now very susceptible to the argument that you don't negotiate with the government, you go out there and you take power through confrontation. So I'm quite worried that those people in their 40s and 50s who are saying we don't negotiate with the government are getting a growing army of young unemployed blacks who are following them. And we're quite worried that this will undercut Nelson Mandela and what he is trying to do. I think Mandela has the lead right now and should be able to overcome it, but it is very fragile. Secondly, the question is, do the white leaders really mean it when they talk about fundamental change? That's the question we ask ourselves every day in the State Department. Are we going out on a limb, or should we have invited President de Klerk to the United States? Are we taking something for granted that we're not sure of? I've seen President de Klerk a number of times. Secretary Baker has seen him. President Bush wants to see him, and he will in the near future. And we all come away from our meetings with him with the conclusion that he's a very moral individual, he's a very religious individual, and he's a very pragmatic individual who understands that the future of his own community is bound up with the future of the black community. This is pure logic and analysis, and it's not necessarily something that's emotional. He is saying that my grandchildren, I think his first grandchild was just born this year, he is saying that grandchild has no future in South Africa unless the blacks are brought in as full participants, as full partners. And the only way you can get them to be full partners is to give them complete political equality. They're not going to accept just economic equality. They want political equality. And this is a cold calculation that he and his party have made. And these people are in their mid-50s now, who have had much better education than their parents. And they're bound to, and determined to go through with it. So we're convinced, but the jury is still out on with a lot of people.
The question is, does political equality mean one man, one vote to the or one person, one vote, indeed. Thank you, Mr. Drayton. As opposed to a Rhodesia-like or a Zimbabwean-type constitution, I presume is the intent. Yes.
One man, one vote is one of those politically charged terms which scares politicians. But they do believe in one man, one vote in the white leadership, if you mean by that universal suffrage. In other words, everybody's vote will be equal. There will be no weighted voting. What the white leadership is talking about now is that they're worried about pure majority rule without any checks and balances on the majority. And they point out that every Western democracy that you can think of has some checks and balances on the pure majority rule, just like the United States does. So what they hope to negotiate are some sort of safeguards built into the Constitution which would make it difficult for the majority to change some fundamental requirements of the white community without, say, they would have to have 2/3 or something like that for such things as Afrikaner schools and other cultural things that they need, or confiscation of property without due process and that sort of thing. So what we're trying to convince them right now is the way to achieve that is to have an American-style Bill of Rights which is protected by an independent judiciary. And if you have that, then you don't need anything like group rights or specific minority safeguards in the Constitution. And we think, although it's a highly charged political problem in the white community, we think they're evolving in that direction. They no longer use the term group rights. They now use the term checks and balances and safeguards. And we think through a negotiating process they will see that a Bill of Rights with an independent judiciary will really take care of their fears of the tyranny of the majority.
Would you give, as fair as you can, the most empathetic description of the South African definition of apartheid?
Apartheid began as a political philosophy and was implemented, or they began to implement it in 1948 when the National Party came to power. And the whole idea of apartheid was that the South African geographic entity has many nations within it, and that everybody should belong to his or her own nation and vote within that nation, and there should be no mixing among the nations. So the white people felt that they had their nation, which was based on Afrikanerdom, and every other black was assigned to a nation. So if you were a Zulu, you belonged to the Zulu nation. If you're a Xhosa, you belonged either to the Transkei or the Ciskei nation. And the whole theory was that everybody is a citizen of one of those nations, no matter where they happen to be living. And the government then proceeded to implement this philosophy. They created a number of self-governing homelands, each of which was ethnically pure in terms of being one nation. And every black in South Africa was expected to be a citizen of one of those nations and vote in that nation. So you had the phenomenon of blacks living in cities like Johannesburg or Cape Town or Pretoria who had been there for several generations. They had never known their so-called nations. They were born there, their fathers were born there, and their grandfathers, and they were suddenly told, you're not a citizen of South Africa anymore, you're a citizen of KwaZulu, you're a citizen of Transkei, and therefore you can't vote here, you have no rights here, you only have rights in this other place, you see. And this was unacceptable because these people had no contacts with those places. Maybe they had some relatives there, but they had no ties, no economic ties. And certainly they couldn't be asked to go live there because they were needed in Johannesburg and all these places as part of the economy. So in 1948, it looked very good as a philosophy, but over the years, it was shown to be totally unviable economically and totally unviable politically. They had to have separate school systems for every national group. Every university had its own linguistic, so you had universities speaking Xhosa, you had universities speaking Zulu. It was just totally unrealistic for a modern industrialized society. And by the mid-1980s, or even earlier, everybody realized it was a total failure and could not possibly work, that the people of South Africa were so integrated, socially and economically, that they in fact were one nation. They were not several nations. And that a way had to be found to translate this into political realities. And that's what we're getting today. A translation, a transfer from apartheid to something that corresponds to modern day industrial society. And that can only happen in terms of total political equality. Apartheid had a certain philosophical morality which said, sure, we're all equal. Whites are no better than blacks, but they have to have their own nations. You see, that was the whole, and it was supported by the church. The Afrikaner church put out doctrine that said this is moral and it fits in with the Bible. But 3 years ago, the Afrikaner church changed its doctrine and said it is now immoral and it no longer fits in with church doctrine. So it's a tremendous transference of thinking, and some of the older generation and some of the less enlightened generation are fighting it tooth and nail.
The question refers back to a point you referred to earlier, Mr. Secretary, and that is, do we have sufficient grounds for trusting the word of the South African government?
Well, our feeling is that we should give rewards only when good things take place. So far, we feel some good things have taken place. We feel that the legalization of black political organizations is a positive development. Before FW de Klerk's announcement, the African National Congress was illegal. Now the African National Congress is legal. Various other parties of South Africa are legal. This is a positive development. The fact that Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and other leaders have been released from prison, this is a positive development. Is that enough? Of course not. It's not enough. Apartheid still has a long way to go before it is abolished. United States sanctions against South Africa are based on legislation. The legislation tells us when we could even begin to relax sanctions if we want to do that. That point has not arrived yet. The legislation demands the same things that the African National Congress is demanding. A total legalization of political life in South Africa. If the government lifts the state of emergency and releases all political prisoners, they will have fulfilled the requirements of the sanctions legislation, and the president will have the authority in law to relax sanctions if he wants to do that. We have not promised to do that. We have said we will consult closely with the United States Congress to determine if we wish to relax any of the sanctions. I'm quite persuaded that if we do it, it will only be limited, and we will keep sanctions in place until apartheid is totally finished. The one thing we've agreed with in Congress right now is we will not apply any new sanctions this year because of these positive developments that I've just mentioned. And one way we're trying to show support to F.W. de Klerk and to encourage him to do even more is to invite him to the United States to see President Bush. And we hope he will be coming in the next few months. But when he comes here, we'll tell him, what you've done so far is nice, but you have a long way to go, and we want to encourage you to move along that road very quickly. So we're not assuming that apartheid is dead. We're assuming just a good beginning has taken place, and we want to encourage more progress.
The question is a domestic one, which is of importance locally in South Africa. Is the South African government going to have an improved transportation policy broadly understood?
I think that's one of the great imbalances of apartheid, created by apartheid, that has to be corrected very early. The other ones are education, where so little money has been spent on black education compared to white education, and housing, where so little money has been spent on black housing compared to white housing, and in transportation. And I know what you're referring to, where black workers who go into Johannesburg every day sometimes have to get up at 4 in the morning in order to get to work at 8 in the morning, and then have to go another 3 or 4 hours on the way home. And the whole system of townships and the segregation really has to be totally destroyed and remade in order to address that imbalance. There are automobiles manufactured in South Africa. Ford and General Motors have been in South Africa, but they disinvested because as a protest against apartheid. Their companies have been bought out by others. So there are automobiles and taxis and buses manufactured in South Africa, or assembled mainly. So that is not a problem. The problem is the whole apartheid structure, which forces blacks to have a transportation problem because they're forced to live further and further away from the white communities. When apartheid is abolished, people will be living a lot closer to each other and a lot closer to where they work, which is the normal way of doing things.
Would you attempt, sir, to describe as best you can the complexity of politics within the various tribes within the black community?
It's not easy to do that because black political expression was non-existent for many, many years. Black political life was not normal, and it was suppressed. What we can tell, you have the whole spectrum of opinion from people who believe in free enterprise, people who believe in socialism or Marxism, what have you. So I would say that the blacks are just as diversified as the whites, and you'll get all sorts of views. 70% of the black community is Christian in South Africa, and they're heavily influenced by Christian beliefs and Christian values, and go to church regularly. So in that sense, there's a great deal of links between the black and the white communities. There are people who belong to various indigenous churches, which we don't have outside of South Africa, would have various value systems. So I would say that you have the whole spectrum there, and what I would see in a free, independent, democratic South Africa is people making alliances. Sure, people will vote along ethnic lines, just like we do in the United States, but I think eventually there'll be alliances along ideological lines, just like we have in the United States.
Would you comment specifically, following up on the last question, on Chief Buthelezi and the role of his role and the role of the Zulu Nation, especially with respect to the ANC?
Chief Minister Gacha Buthelezi is the effectively Prime Minister of one of these self-governing homelands that I was talking to you about before, the self-governing territory of KwaZulu, which is centered around the Zulu ethnic group, which has about 7 million people, which would be approximately 25% of the black population of South Africa. Now, Chief Minister Buthelezi is a very controversial figure in South Africa because he accepted to work within the system, whereas the leaders of the African National Congress and other black political groups rejected the apartheid system, and because they rejected the apartheid system, either had to go to jail because they were convicted of treason, or they went into exile and started the armed struggle. They totally rejected it. But Buthelezi said, I will work within the system and try to fight apartheid within the system. So he formed a political party. He called it Inkatha. They competed in the elections held in the self-governing homeland of KwaZulu. They won the election and they took power. And they proceeded to assume the governing role in that area, but as part of the South African apartheid system, where they were subsidized by the South African government. So Buthelezi and Inkatha were rejected by the others who were in jail or in exile. However, in our opinion, he did fight apartheid from within the system. Now, how did he fight apartheid? First of all, he refused to become an independent country. Other homelands like Ciskei and Transkei and Venda and Bafuthat-Swana, they accepted independence and they became independent Bantustans, which the whole world had rejected, which nobody recognized, but fit in with the apartheid philosophy of separate nations. Buthelezi said, no, we reject this system. Secondly, he refused to be co-opted into the white system of negotiating a new sort of Uncle Tom type of multiracial government. He refused to accept town councilors, which were fit in with a white-dominating system. He said, we want to negotiate only an end to apartheid and true majority rule. He even said that he would refuse to negotiate with the government until Nelson Mandela was released from prison. So in his own way, he felt that he was fighting apartheid and causing the government trouble and helping to push the government into this new thinking that I was mentioning before. He also opposed economic sanctions on South Africa. He said that the blacks were the ones who would suffer more than the whites. In economic terms, he was right. The blacks did suffer more than the whites, but a lot of blacks said they were willing to take that suffering if it meant the end of apartheid. So he became the enemy of many political leaders within South Africa. In our view, he is a leader who commands a large number of votes in his particular regional area of South Africa. And in any election, we feel that he would get enough votes to give him a place at the table or to give him a large number of seats in any parliament. And therefore, he should be taken into consideration in any negotiating scenario. He should be part of it. Now, one of the results of this hatred between the political leaders on the one hand and Buthelezi has been violence in the province of Natal as people are fighting for political domination. The African National Congress, the United Democratic Front, has been trying to get a foothold in Buthelezi's area. There's been resistance and there's been fighting. And the fighting has gotten so bad now that it's almost out of hand in terms of the youth who are not controllable. The police find it hard to control. And in my view, the only way this can be ended is for Nelson Mandela and Buthelezi to get together and sign a peace pact, which would say, let us put aside our differences now and work toward ending apartheid, because we both want the same thing. We both want a free, democratic, non-racial, representative society in South Africa. I believe that Nelson Mandela came out of prison with the intention of doing that, but his colleagues in the African National Congress told him, you must not give Buthelezi legitimacy by appearing in public with him and shaking his hand and embracing him, because too many of our people have suffered in the fighting that's going on in Natal. My view, Buthelezi exists. He has a lot of support And until the rest of the political leaders in South Africa recognize this and accept him, there will not be peace in that province of Natal. So my feeling is Nelson Mandela is going to have to overcome this bitterness and make peace with Buthelezi for the good of all of South Africa.
Would you comment upon the future of Mozambique and how the United States might positively influence it?
I think the premise of your question is quite correct. Mozambique has suffered more than any other country in Africa over the last 20 years. The devastation has just been beyond belief in terms of the civil conflict that has gone on there. And the atrocities committed by the Renamo guerrillas have just been, something you don't even want to imagine. 1 million refugees have left Mozambique to live in neighboring countries. That's about 1/8 of the population. And entire infrastructure has been destroyed. Guerrillas have gone into towns and destroyed everything. And people have been made, it's just a horrible situation, and many people in Mozambique don't even know that there is a Mozambique. The communications have been disrupted so badly. However, we feel that peace must come to Mozambique and the refugees must return because the country can't go on this way. It must be brought back to some sort of normality. And the international community now is spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year just to keep people alive in Mozambique or the refugees in neighboring areas. We'd much rather spend that money on economic development. Both the government and the rebels are to blame for this. The government for having very unpopular policies between 1975 and 1985, which caused so many people to support rebels, and the rebels for following a sort of a Khmer Rouge type of philosophy. Just destroy everything and start from zero again. So we believe the only way to settle this is through some sort of a negotiation where the rebels will be brought back into society, integrate them into society, and start fresh. So we'd like to change our $100 million a year that we're putting into Mozambique now from food assistance and relief and medicine into development assistance. And we think it's quite possible. There's absolutely no further rationale for continued fighting in that country, and everyone realizes it.
What is your comment upon the possibility of sufficient economic growth within the black community in South Africa in order to stabilize and prevent violence?
Well, South Africa has such a well-developed modern sector. We think that once sanctions are lifted and once normal situation returns, that there will be a large amount of investment capital available to expand industry, to expand agriculture, and to expand anything you like. And I believe that in an expanding economy, there will be lots of job creation and lots of ways that blacks can come into the modern system through jobs and through bringing them into the professions. A lot of American companies have done some good work in South Africa in what I call social responsibility programs, upgrading black workers so they can become managers, upgrading black housing. We have a program there called Black Entrepreneurship, where we're trying to bring people into small and medium-sized businesses and giving them the necessary training. So we feel that there's such a great amount of potential in South Africa already that the normalization of life there will lead to an explosion of investment, both internal and externally supported investment, which should create a lot of jobs and a lot of opportunities for the black community. We feel, therefore, it's very important that the black leaders understand some economic realities. We think too many of the black leaders are now talking language that was used in the 1950s. The way to redress the imbalances is through nationalization of industry. The way to redress the imbalance or redistribute wealth is through socialism. We're telling them now, look what happened in Eastern Europe and look what happened in the rest of Africa by countries that adopted these philosophies. These philosophies did not result in economic growth, but resulted in economic decline. So we're hoping that they will keep an open mind and look at other economic models. Some of the social democratic models of Western Europe that we think would be more adequate, or more appropriate for South Africa. So if they adopt the correct policies, do not kill the goose that lays the golden egg, in South Africa and work for economic expansion. We think there'll be tremendous potential there. But the international community will have to help with education, with housing, with upgrading of industrial workers. There'll be a large need for help, and I think the type of thing we're doing now in Eastern Europe, the Economic European Reconstruction Bank, I think would have a good parallel in a Southern African Reconstruction Bank.
Is the United States pressuring European states who actually had lifted their sanctions against South Africa?
There are no European states that have really done that except the UK. The UK has lifted a sanction called voluntary, what do they call that? I forgot, it's something to do with cultural exchange and sports and that sort of thing. They said that they're now no longer asking cultural groups and sporting groups to boycott South Africa. That is the one thing they have done. We have told the UK that whatever they do is their business, and we're not going to tell them what to do. And as you know, it's hard to tell Margaret Thatcher what to do.
I would like to thank you, sir. I'm always impressed by the energy which our representatives bring after a long and busy day in Washington, and in this case, by the extraordinarily comprehensive and succinct description of our policies there, and your analysis of a variety of issues. It's been a most informative session. We thank you.